Hey, welcome to our online church service. My name is Josh Carsonson. I'm the lead pastor here, and I just wanted to say thank you for joining us and checking us out. If you are newer to Northwest Hills and you're just trying to see what we're all about, this is a really cool, easy avenue to watch, to see what's happening, and this is a nice first step to joining us on a Sunday. If you're a part of our church family and you're very familiar with us and you are out of town for the weekend, you got a fun vacation, you got a job thing, or you're sick and you can't make it on Sunday, what a cool way that you can watch a church service later throughout the week. But if this is something that you're doing in replacement of Sunday morning gathering, we would just encourage you, as Scripture says, don't forsake the weekly gathering. Join the people. This gathering where we're worshiping God, where we're hearing from His Word, where we are connecting with one another is really pivotal to what it means to belong to a church. And so we would invite you, come on a Sunday morning. Again, thank you for joining us. We hope that you enjoy this service as it helps you in your process of loving Jesus, living like Jesus, and making Him known.
All right, let's go ahead and grab a seat. Yes. All right. Oh, man. Yeah. So first hour, I'm preaching and we're talking about Exodus today, and I'll give you context for that in a minute. But I'm asking the question, it seems silly that God would use these plagues. It's like this seems silly. Why would God do that? And I'm talking about how God is exercising His power over pagan gods. And I'm specifically saying, why, all these silly little plagues of gnats and flies and bugs. And literally, as I'm speaking, a box elder lands on my face while I am saying this specific point about why would God use bugs. And I've never had that happen in, 20 years of preaching. And so I think there's something special here. I think God's saying, hey, pay attention today. If you asked me what I learned in first service, I would say nothing other than God has control over everything, including little bugs. And maybe that is what we will learn through Exodus today. So, my name is Josh. I am the lead pastor here. Last week we started a series where we're going through the entire Bible this year. And we gave you a resource to kind of go along with that. It's a reading help. It's kind of a journal type thing. I feel like I need to apologize again because last week we ran out. We ordered a few hundred. We ordered a few hundred more, got them, and we ran out again. So I'm super sorry. Lack of faith on our staff's part for not printing more. This might be helpful, maybe not. If you wanted one and didn't get one, can you raise your hand just so I have a rough gauge? Okay, that's a fair bit. Okay, so we will order some more. Ultimately, going through the Bible one book a week, more or less. Last week, we started in the book of Genesis. And if you were with us, we talked about how Genesis is an interesting book. It's interesting in that it starts with God creating, and it starts in this garden, and it starts where everything is good and right and beautiful. And God, He's walking with Adam and Eve, and it's just this very intimate, beautiful, huge high hope. And then by the time you get to chapter 50, we're scratching our heads going, God, what just happened? Because previously there was no death, and now there's death, and we were in a garden with you, and now we're in a pagan land with all kinds of foreign gods, and we've got death, and Joseph is in a coffin. God, what happened there? And we talked about how at the end of the day, we're going to see through the story of Genesis how God knows exactly what He's doing. How through the complete unexpected movement of Him, through the unexpected, one man from the middle of nowhere, God is going to ultimately sustain a nation for a while through famine, but then bring a nation to their knees. And we're going to see that today. And so today we're going to be introduced to this guy, Moses, and we're going to be introduced to how God is going to not only free His people, but He is going to establish that He is the one true God. Because we realize there are many gods in this world. Right? We have all kinds of gods. We worship different gods. We don't necessarily have little altars next to our bedstands. Maybe we do in our phones. But historically speaking, we have always worshiped false gods. They had names, they had carved images. We have them. It's called the weekend. It's called entertainment. It's called our family. It's called power, influence, looks, whatever you want. We have gods, and God is going to establish early on in Exodus that He and He alone ought to be worshiped. Because when we worship anything that isn't Him, and I mean anything, including our kids, including good times with our families, when we worship anything that is not God, God doesn't get the glory, which isn't right. And ultimately, we don't get the life that we truly want. And so at the end of the day, by the time we're done, my hope is one thing. My hope is that we will be able to say the same thing as Moses said. And Moses and God have this fascinating conversation towards the end of Exodus where God ultimately says, okay, Moses, you can have everything. You can have it all. I'll give you the land. Right? I will give you freedom from your enemies. You will flourish, but I'm not going with you. So you can have anything that your heart wants except for me. And Moses says, God, if you're not going, I don't want any of it. So how do we get there? Because the truth is, like, most of our world says, yeah, that's awesome. I'd like most of those things. Right? And if God, you could be a part of my life, I'll take that too. But if not, as long as I get everything else over here, that'd be pretty nice. Can I have a nice family? Can I have a nice vacation? Can I have influence? Can I have power? Moses says, I don't want any of it if I don't get you. And so that's what we're going to see today. In order to see that, we're going to pick it up in the midst of all kinds of oppression. We got to go Exodus chapter 1. So if you got a Bible, it's the second book in the Bible. We're doing an overview, a jump in, and then the invitation for you this week would be to read it cover to cover or with one of the more simplified plans that you see in your little journal there. So if you could, would you stand with me? We're going to read the opening few verses here of Exodus chapter 6. And we're going to see what God is going to do through the midst of a really, really hard time in Egypt. I'm going to start in verse 6 here. Then Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to the people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You can grab a seat. There's a lot of scripture that we read, and when we read it, it's tragic. And this is one of those tragic parts of Scripture where you read, and here's this man, Joseph. He was in all kinds of power. He was leading in the house of Pharaoh, and now he dies, and a new Pharaoh comes, and his family's forgotten, and this kind of family grows and grows and grows, and they grow in influence, but they speak a different language, and they look different, and they worship different, and the Egyptians are threatened by this. Right? This is kind of the natural progression of mankind. We see this all over. Ultimately, when we look different from each other, when we worship different things, we start to say things like, well, you're different than me. I'm good, you're bad. I'm right, you're wrong. And we see this really, really early on, and that leads to terrible subjugation. Here it leads to slavery. We see this historically in families. Right? We see it across nations. We see this in friend groups. And so this progression of enslavement and an absolute terrible way to treat people is something that we see very early on. And God's going to do something about it. So we're going to see God is going to do something not only to the Egyptians who are abusing and enslaving, but we're going to see God doing something to the Egyptians who are worshiping what is not God. You think about this fact that they were in slavery, and they were enslaved for 400 years. That's brutal. Like, think with me for just a minute. It creates all kinds of questions. First of all, like, God, why would you allow this to happen? And God knew that it was going to happen a long time ago. You go back to Genesis chapter 15. A lot of you read that this week. When God was calling Abraham early on in Genesis 15, he says, and your descendants, right? And this is a large group of people, right? So you go Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, or Jacob, Joseph, and then his kids. Like, he promises Abraham, he says, for 400 years, your descendants are going to be enslaved. You think, like, why would God do that? What is that all about? Why is God not only allowing, but seemingly, potentially causing this to happen? What in the world? Is it simply because God's people weren't crying out for help? Right? You have to believe that somewhere someone said, God, could you do something about this situation? Right? My children are being abused. My dad is going out to the fields, and it's brutal here. God, why won't you do something? And we're going to see through the depth in which they were enslaved is the depth that we need saving from. And you think about this. We are talking about this history 4,000 years later. Right? For thousands of years, people are asking the question, man, is God that powerful? Did it really happen? Even in Time magazine this last year, there was an article, did the 10 plagues really happen? And you think about how great of a need there was. When a group of people is enslaved for 400 years, they had no escape of getting out. God had to show, like, I and I alone am the only hope that people have. They weren't able to cause some, uprising and take over Egypt. They had no hope. For 400 years, they were nothing but slaves, which is brutal, right? Especially when you read the story and you realize towards the end of it, not only were they enslaved, but they start killing their babies. Egypt starts killing the babies of the Hebrews. They take all the young boys and they throw them into the river. I mean, imagine just that pain. And you have to ask, well, God, it's great that you are seen as so mighty in such a great rescue, but what about the people who are living through it? Doesn't seem super fair to them, right? What about the people in year 240? Or what about the young mom who just has her first son and an Egyptian official rips it out of her arms and throws it into the river? Like, that's pretty painful to think about. God, where are you in this? In order to answer that question, we got to go back to Genesis. We got to go to chapter 3, and we got to see that sin is real, right? That humanity is brutal towards one another, right? That sin is a breaking of what God commands us to do, and God says we need to cherish one another. We need to love one another. We need to honor life, and when we don't, we feel that weight. We feel the gravitas of what is happening here in this enslavement in Egypt. And ultimately what we're going to see today is we're going to see both a God who is absolutely committed to justice, but we're going to see a God who is also radically merciful, dealing with not only the Egyptians and their abuse, but their worship of foreign gods and God's mercy to this people of Israel. And so what does it look like for God to be a God who is fierce in his judgment? All right, let's hear the cry of the people in Exodus chapter 2. This is God's people crying out, asking him to do something. So Exodus 2, verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. The phrase there, God knew, indicates that now was the time that God was going to do something about it, and so he does. He does something incredible. He, through the work of Moses, someone who no one would have expected, does this incredible freeing of this people, primarily through what we're going to experience as these 10 plagues. And these 10 plagues are super interesting. They're kind of goofy. They seem kind of childlike. It's like, really, this feels like a fairy tale. God, why are you going to rescue people through like turning water into blood and bugs and, death of animals and ultimately the killing of the firstborn? What's going on there? Is this historical or is this just, an old story? You think about who God is and how God works and moves, and if God wanted to, he could have done it like this. And from what we see, he did. And we're going to see why. Why did God do it this way? Because again, it sounds like a child's story, right? It sounds like something you read to your sixth grader. And then there were bugs, and then there were flies, and then there were gnats, and then there was pestilence and boils. What was God doing in this? Right? Why was he establishing his judgment this way? You look at the plagues, and ultimately what God is doing is he's saying to the world superpower at the time, you're worshiping false gods. And there were false gods behind all the gods that they were worshiping. They were real. You think about when Moses throws a staff down and it turns into a snake. Like, you read that and you go, like, that's pretty wild. Like, that's normally not something that you and I would see on a normal day. God's behind that. But then the Egyptians are able to do that as well, right? Because there's real power behind it. There's real gods. Call it demons, call it God. God is establishing his judgment over the worship of Egyptian gods. And if you were to walk through every single one of these plagues, and we don't have time to do that, but if you were to walk through, you would notice that each one of these are a major god that the people worshiped, right? You start with the Nile, the first plague that Moses helps lead, and the Nile turns into blood, right? The Nile was one of their primary gods, a god over the Nile, because think about it, it was their source of food. It was their source of protection over their enemies. And God's immediately saying, no, I have power over this God that you're worshiping. And you go all the way through and you can see all the different gods that the Egyptians are worshiping. And God's going to again and again say, I am bringing these plagues to show you that I am more powerful. And he directly says this multiple times in the book of Exodus. This is that moment where that bug came and landed on my face. So go chapter 7, verse 5. God's going to spell out what he's doing multiple times here. He says this in verse 5 of chapter 7. It says, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. Chapter 9, verse 13. Let my people go that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you yourself and on your servants and your people, that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. Right? He's saying, I could have killed you all instantly, but I am going to show you that I am most powerful. He continues in verse 15. For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. We see this in chapter 12, verse 12. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute my judgment. Here's God saying, he says, hey, I see all your pyramids. I see your power. I see your military might. I see the gods that you're worshiping. And ultimately, when you worship these gods, they're not the one true God, and they won't give you what your heart ultimately wants. Right? Your heart wants to worship what's right and what's true and what's good, and that is me alone, not these other things that you chase after. And we chase after a lot of things. So God is executing his judgment, and he does it in a really powerful, very direct way towards the end when he's establishing all these different plagues. At the very end, we pick this up in chapter 14, we're going to see he obliterates the entire army. I'm going to read a big chunk here. So starting in chapter 14, verse 4, listen to God's interaction. He says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. This is after the people have been freed. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. Verse 6, so Pharaoh made ready his chariot and took his army with him. He took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots in Egypt. So imagine you have the entire Egyptian army with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, verse 13. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to be silent. If you were to read the rest, you have this image of 2 million people going through the Red Sea, and through some mighty wind, God parts the sea, and the people go across on dry land, and the army comes after them, and God commands Moses. He says, put your staff over the sea, and he does, and the sea goes down, and all the Egyptian army is killed. The entire thing. Verse 28 says, the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, and all of the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. So you stop for a minute and you think about God is a God who is fiercely executing judgment on things that are wrong. Right? You've got a nation who enslaved someone else. You've got a nation who is abusing again and again, who is murdering children. And God says, oh, I will execute judgment. You watch me. I will execute judgment on their gods, and watch me execute judgment on them. Their whole army is obliterated. At the end of the day, God executes judgment on what we worship as well. You think about all the different gods that we have, and we've got a lot of them, like I said earlier. We all have our own. We all have our favorite ones. Mine's probably entertainment. I love, when someone says, you want to do something? My answer is always yes, right? We all have different things that we go to that ultimately, if we're not careful, can take place of worshiping what we ought to. And God says, I will execute judgment on that. But then we also see this other part of God. And this is a tension that we get in the human life, that we get forever. It's that God is incredibly committed to judgment, to what is right, but he's also incredibly merciful. He's incredibly kind. And man, one of the biggest struggles, and I think we will have this throughout the entire Bible, every single week at some point or another, we will see this tension between God's judgment and God's mercy. Right? You think about the cross. Like, if you know the story of who Jesus is, that cross is a picture of both God's incredible judgment, yet God's extravagant mercy. And you think about God's mercy, and you think about our lives and how we're able to stand and move and breathe and even proclaim God's name. That is nothing but mercy. Right? That is nothing but grace. On Friday, I was having lunch with Pastor Rob from Calvary, and I was just asking him, I was like, man, you've been at this for 27 years. Like, what's the secret sauce? How do you do it? And the first words out of his mouth were mercy and grace. Like, God's just been kind. God has been kind to us. So how is God kind? How is he merciful? How is he merciful in such a way that Moses is able to say, God, I don't want anything if you're not there? Let's go to verse 13 of chapter 14. I read it earlier. I'm going to reread it again, and we're going to see God's radical mercy. God says to Moses as they are crossing the Red Sea, he says, fear not, stand firm, and see the power of salvation which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. Right? He says, see it. Look what God's going to do. You can't fight this. You're not going to win. It's not like you can create a bunch of pitchforks and you get a little army. You cannot defeat this. Watch what God's going to do. And he's doing it because he's God and he's kind. Verse 29, but the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, and the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Man, that is radical mercy. You think about God fighting for them and the fact that they were completely helpless. That's who God is. He's a God of mercy. But we're going to see as the story continues in the second half of the book of Exodus that we're fighting against an enemy not only that is external, obviously we saw that in Egypt, but we're going to see that there is an enemy that is internal as well. Because follow along with the story. The people cross the Red Sea and they get to the other side, and God does one thing. He takes them to the desert, which is really interesting. He doesn't immediately take them to the place of abundance. He takes them to the desert to test them, to see, am I going to be enough? Am I going to be enough? God does that sometimes, right? Because often when we have everything, right, when we have the house, when we have the friends, when we have the relationship, when we've got the job, it's easy to say, God, I don't need you. So he takes them to the desert and he says, I'm going to take everything away, and then let me see where your heart is. And that's what he does. And we're going to see the internal enemy that creeps up, because what happens? Day number 3, they don't have food. Day number 3. And what do? They start complaining. Chapter 16, verse 2, and the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we have died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. You're like, really? Like, it seems like maybe God has a plan here, that maybe he cares for you. Like, God has done it before. Maybe he'll do it again. And the people are going, God hates us. God is not for me. He doesn't see me. This should sound familiar. God is merciful here. He's like, all right, guys, I got you. He rains down bread from heaven. right? And then we get to the very next chapter, chapter 17. A few days later, they're thirsty. And what do they say? God, you're not for me. You never provide. Like, oh yeah, what about that time when there was rain from bread in heaven? No, God, you're not for me. Right? This should sound like some of our lives, right? Like, God, I was struggling and you helped me, but I forgot about that. God, maybe you're not for me anymore. God, maybe you don't exist. Maybe if you don't help me in this immediate situation, then I'm just going to walk away. And again, God is merciful, and he makes bitter water sweet so they can drink. And this is the human heart. We keep struggling with this internal desire of not wanting to follow God like we ought to. And we see the story only continue on, and it gets worse. You see the story as they go from chapters 19 to 40. It's a year-long journey, and they're at the bottom of the mountain of Sinai. And God says to them, he says, okay, I'm going to do something incredible through you guys. It's like he takes this group of people and he says, hey, I'm picking you out of the entire world. There's life going on in ancient China, and there's life going on in Americas, but I'm going to use you. And this family, this 2 million some odd people, I'm going to show the entire world my goodness through you. I just want you to follow me and obey me. And all the people are like, yes, Lord, you have brought us out of Egypt. You have given us water. You've given us bread. We're all in. Whatever you say to do, we're going to do it. So it's okay, well, let me give you some formal instruction on how to live. And he says this, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, and God gives him the 10 Commandments. And you guys have seen these. But notice where he starts with the 10 Commandments. He starts with chapter 20, verse 2. He's given this word of what it looks like for them to follow him. And he says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. He just reminds them. He says, I brought you out of slavery. You didn't do it. I did this for you. You shall have no other gods before me. That's a primary purpose. Don't worship false gods. Worship me. You shall not make for yourself to carve image or anything in the likeness that is in heaven above or in earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. Okay, so like, yeah, the people hear that, and there's like this huge ceremony, this back and forth of like, yep, God, we're in. We're following you 100%. And God says, okay, Moses, come back up the mountain. I got 40 more days for you. Come up the mountain. I'm going to give you instructions on what it would look like to build a place where I can dwell with your people. And Moses goes up to the mountain. And when Moses is on the top of the mountain, what happens? When Moses is on the top of the mountain, we read some of the most ridiculous, tragic words in chapter 32, verse 1. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come up or come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron. This is Moses' brother. And they said to him, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron said to them, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons and your daughters, bring them to me. So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hands and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. What? I'm pretty sure God just rescued them out of slavery. I'm pretty sure he ripped apart the Red Sea. I'm pretty sure they saw like the whole army. Really, we're gonna create a little figurine, and we're going to place it in the assembly in front of a few million people, and we're going to worship this thing that this now is what saved us. This is the God that we should love. And God says, I'm out. I'm out. And he makes a promise to Moses, and he says, here's the deal. I'm going to give you what I promised. He says, I'm going to give you the land I promised Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. I'll send an angel before you. I'm going to drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey. He says, I will give you anything that you think you want. You think you need a new house? I'll give you a new house. You think you need a new car? I'll give you a car. You think you need early retirement? I'll give you that. You think you want your sports team to win? I'll give you that. You think you need a nice special date with your spouse? I'll give you that. But I ain't going with you. He says, I'm out. And we have this powerful back and forth moment between Moses and God. And how is Moses able to say, no, God, if you're not going, we're not going? He's able to say, God, I saw you do this. I saw it. I know, I saw the snake. I saw the river turn to blood. I saw Pharaoh. I saw the sea. I saw it all. And even when I saw it, we still forgot. Ultimately, God, have mercy. Have mercy. Because we can see it. Right? And here's the same thing for us. We have a cross that says God is insanely committed to his judgment. Right? That's why Jesus died, to pay for sin. But we have a cross that also says that Jesus is insanely merciful. And when we see that, we're reminded again and again and again, we need that mercy because we will forget. And so God does something beautiful, and he does something that we've never seen in the first 2 books. He says, this is who I am. And I'm going to show you who I am, and then I'm going to tell you who I am. He says to Moses, he says, hey, Moses, I'm going to show you who I am. Because he promised, he says, okay, I will go. And Moses says, God, I don't know if I can just take your word on this. You got to prove it to me. And so he says, all right, here, I'm going to show you who I am. And so God puts Moses in the cleft of a rock, and he covers his face, and he walks by. And Moses gets to see his back, just a remnant of who he is. And then God says, and here's who I am. I'm going to spell it out for you. And we see these words echoed again and again and again. And I'm going to read a bunch of these here in a minute. But listen to what God says to Moses as a self-proclaimed description of who he is. This is in chapter 34, verse 5. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generations. And Moses quickly bowed his head towards heaven, or towards earth, and worshiped. Father God, we thank you that you are a merciful God. God, that we get this picture of ourselves longing for all kinds of things that are not you. God, we make gods out of everything. And you will establish your judgment on all these gods. And ultimately, I've got a God in my own heart that says, yeah, I'll be my own God. I'll do what I want. And when we're face to face with judgment, and when we're face to face with mercy, God, let us see a picture of you, a picture of that cross that shows us your true nature. Lord, as we're finishing out here, I'm going to read a bunch of your words that you gave for the next 2,000 years. People were referring back to these words. People like David and Joel and Nehemiah and Jonah and Micah. Lord, Psalm 86:15 says, but you, O Lord, are a God of mercy. You are slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Joel 2:13 says, and rend your hearts and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and he relents over disaster. Psalm 103, the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. He will not always chide, nor will he keep his anger forever. He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love for those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger. Jonah 4:2, and he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste and fled to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God, that you're merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and you are relenting from disaster. Micah 7:18, who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inheritance? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in steadfast love. Lord, in this picture that we get from Moses of your steadfast love, give us a heart like Moses. God, eyes that see the power of your love and a heart that begs for mercy when we don't love you like we ought to. God, I know that I have a wanton heart. I know that I chase things that I ought not to. Yet because you are gracious and merciful, you're slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, you gave me a redeemer. And you put yourself on that cross and you took on your fierce judgment. God, I want to live out of that. Thank you. We love you, Jesus. Amen.